Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not aware if you are aware that the carnival season has started already this year. Video a milestone you will reach thereafter, unlike myself. Here in the institutional investor side, and then China.
China to me, China. China. You want to buy from China?
Yeah. Why is this insignificant, I wanted to say. Why isn't 2022 already the past? Yes, it is. At least in my world, yes, it is. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to Funds Economics. What are we going to dive into today? You might wonder. And of course, I'm keen to tell you. Today we are going to have a closer look into CG, standing effectively for corporate governance. So why do we do so, actually? Why is it important in case of AIF-related matters? Self-evidently, I'm going to tell you about this, of course. We do so for in case you find yourself, e.g., as a fund admin in a current onboarding process, or maybe as being part of a fund structuring team, or actually as part of whatever team, in the midst of an onboarding process of a new fund, a sub-fund or FIF, whatever. This becomes actually very important. Why that? Why is that so? Is not CG generally an equity-related matter, you might ask yourself now? And you're right, indeed. But how investment funds are incorporated in Luxembourg? Do you know? Well, as UCITS, as SIFs, as RAIFs, and so on and so forth. That was not so much a point, actually. But what is the legal form of these very vehicles? And here gets then important. For example, it can appear as an FCP in case it's a pure mutual fund because of having no legal personality, we remember, or as a SICAV with variable capital and so on, etc., etc. Not to forget, actually, investment funds are generally companies. Yes, they are. Even though we are not dealing with PLCs like in the equity market, we deal anyways with legal forms of companies, and they do have some regulatory frameworks applicable. Of course, that is the case. And they also include then CG, which are actually also, obligatory for the creation of such entities. And from another point of view, this might be interesting also in case you'd be an investment banker. You would be in IB. In case you are, then welcome to the show. And you wanted to go forward with your IPO for your newly found unicorn that you have in place. Well, then you should have someone in place also taking care of CG matters, because of each country in Europe has actually their own framework regarding CG. In Germany, for example, it's the DCGK, which is actually standing for some German words, which I won't tell you because you will understand them, probably. And therefore, it might be more useful to just stay at the British side of things here. And in the UK, we do have Corporate Governance Code, that's the actual name, which is overseen actually by the FRC, in case you were not aware of this very fact. Well, I could continue now with the Italian version, for example, and all the other European versions. The Italian version is Code di Autodisciplina. Yeah, I think that was the actual code. Well, but I won't do so. You can look it up if you want to. And I think you got it also, what is meant. So speaking of equity now, we do come to equity markets. Well, that is just very logical reasoning. But here lies the main argument for why we should know about CG also in these regards, since the AIF segment is growing, ladies and gentlemen, constantly. And we can ask ourselves, who is actually profiting in the real economy from this very segment? Right, who is it? Well, companies. Why that? Because the alternative market segment makes it way easier to be listed at MTFs. So take, for example, Altonext. which is actually not called anymore Alternext, but Euronext Growth. For example, take that. Or for the Nordic and Baltic states, it is called the Nasdaq First North, for example, established. Besides, of course, the AIM from the UK and the Lux SE, or Luxi, how I always call it, with the segment Euro MTF, for example, catering structured products to international issuers, but especially in terms of SME GMs. Yes, in Germany this is actually comparable with the so-called Mittelstandsbörse. Yeah, which probably will tell nobody anything. So this market is providing long-term capital as well as risk capital, and thereby contributing overall to the economic growth, which is always good to mention, for everyone likes to hear the word economic growth. However, equity markets are themselves growing as well. Ladies and gentlemen, you might be aware that in the financial year of 2022, the equity market was having a market cap of 98 trillion US dollars. To scale that a little bit, to offer you some scaling, that's what I want to say. Take, for example, Forex, which had 6.6 trillion US dollars, global bonds with 128 trillion, but all that is nothing against the derivatives with a market capitalization of approximately like 640 trillion US dollars. So we anyhow see we are not dealing here with a small fish with the equity market. 98 trillion is probably more than I have on my bank account, and I guess yours too. And now when we are talking already about equity markets, and I have mentioned already legislative procedures or matters of European jurisdictions, who is not far from these kind of things? Well, of course, it is the EU and their announcements, meaning, of course, their regulatory frameworks, how they are broadly called. Also regulations, like, for example, in case for CG, important would be MiFID II, actually standing for Market in Financial Instruments Directive 2. Actually, it was entering in force as well to provide you with this information at the 2nd July of 2014, so that you know since when we are dealing with this kind of things. And it is especially therefore important because MiFID II was actually establishing SME GMs. For MiFID II generally is governing the topic of trading and listing securities across EU and EEA, thereby also establishing SME GMs. But of course also SRD2 or SFDR, which was actually a little bit jarring. Well, but at least since 2023 we do have some RTS for them in place. Supposedly that will provide some remedy, hopefully. Not to forget the AIFMD, which should be known to the attentive listener of this channel. EMIR is also coming to my mind, in addition. That would be like frameworks of the EU, which are also covering the topic of CG. Yeah, so now essentially we are full circle. That is where we, of course, should be with a sense of excitement, ladies and gentlemen, eager to learn about all these CG matters instead of watching, for example, the new season of Rick and Morty or doing other stuff. So I covered this topic from two angles. One time I covered it from a very technical and theoretical angle, which is absolutely useless in terms you want to understand the topic. Therefore, I also covered it from a very practical approach, having a very practical approach by diving into the Factbook from the OECD, which is actually a very good source in this case to understand the dynamics of CG. But let's have a look at that at the next slide, I would suggest. Besides, ladies and gentlemen, in case you may like this video, feel free to give it a like, since imagine in case personally, I would sit now personally in front of you and I would take hours of my time explaining you various matters and you would not say thank you in the end. At least I would think something's wrong with you, or you decided to be on the bad side of life, on the dark side. I hope I don't have viewers with that kind of inner mentality. So that would be kind. And thank you for watching. I hope you will like the way I explain the whole thing. And if you actually have questions or anything, I'm happy to get feedback, actually. I rarely get feedback in the comments, so I'm happy receiving feedback. So actually type something. Thanks. So now let's continue with the program and let's have a look at the overview. All right. So let me just quickly introduce you to the execution of this very presentation, as mentioned priorly, whereby I will also shine some light on how we are going to approach this very topic, as also mentioned priorly. So I have mentioned it just a minute ago, probably. We do have two sides of the whole thing. So one time the practical side and one time the more theoretical one. So we will start first off with the practical one, since this will provide us with the real life understanding. And after that, we are going to understand the theoretical aspects better, for we do actually know what they do mean in real life, translated into reality, so to speak. So the first point will be the exploration of the OECD Factbook 2023, which is actually by the release of this video only published a few months ago, actually in September 2023. So it's kind of a current paper, and thereby it's quite nice because we also gain some insights in, well, the global situation in matters of CG. If you actually have no idea, or it's not quite clear what the OECD is and why it is always a good idea to, well, orient on their guidelines, then I recommend you to watch the video about the OECD, which you can find in the description of this video. But of course, this is not necessary for understanding this video. But it is for the people maybe who like to have a more hermeneutic approach. Well, in this exploration of CG matters, we first will have an emphasis on general CG, since, well, the OECD Factbook is of course not specialized or focused on the AIF industry, but to know general things first is, I assume, quite a good idea. Covering this, we will actually have a closer look into the global markets, respective CG, of course, and current developments, which is always good to know, followed then by a more specific look at the CG and institutional frameworks. After that, we will, well, dissect the rights of shareholders, and finally then we are going to break down the whole corporate board of directors. By then we do know already a lot, and do not lack the practical appreciation. Only for the sake of completeness then, we are going to have a close look, or actually only a short overview to the CG frameworks of LAX SE, LAXI, and NREF. You will know what that is when it is time to talk about it. So after that, we actually covered the practical side, and it will be kind of easy to cover then the theoretical perspective. This very perspective actually is powered by, or is presented by myself, but where I get my information from is by the very rich book Corporate Governance Principles, Policies and Practices, which is this nice book here, written by Bob Tricker, and also published, not also, but it is published at Oxford University Press in 2012. Don't worry, I mean, in the theoretical aspect, there's not so much changes. There are not so many changes in 10 years appearing, actually in 11 years. Bob Tricker, the author, was actually the first one who wrote a book about corporate governance, calling it corporate governance in that sense, back in 1984, which was based on his research in the Nuffield College in Oxford. Nuffield? Yeah, correctly, Nuffield. I've never heard about that, actually, but it seems to be existing. So he is also the founder of the research journal Corporate Governance, an International Review. He's actually born 1933, exactly in the year the very book came out that was presented in the pre-introduction. So he's 90 years old by now. Okay, but he still has some stuff to say. This was not in any disrespectful manner that I've said that. Actually, in a respectful manner. I assume we are not doing anything wrong by orienting on a book written by this very guy, who actually studied also in Harvard and then in Oxford. And besides all that, he's been the author of the first code of conduct, I wanted to say, no, but the first corporate governance code in the UK. I have mentioned that just a few minutes ago. Maybe one remembers. Well, after praising Mr. Tricker now, I should maybe also disclose what we will cover then in the second part. So we are going, first of all, to have a look at the definition of CG, thereby having a look also at the scope, in the difference between governance and management. Can you tell me? In the segment of governance and management, actually the first part of the second chapter. It's always confusing with my chapter organization, I think. Then, ladies and gentlemen, we are going to have a look at regulatory frameworks, models of CG, and the function of the board generally. A closer look into risk as well, followed by listed companies and CG, which is important from the IB perspective, which was mentioned also already, but as well from a market dynamics perspective. Ending with practices, shining light on board membership, board leadership, board activities, and a short overview also about CG international contexts. Yes, this is actually all a lot, ladies and gentlemen, and that is why you do find this lecture also divided in 3 parts. And this part here is logically the first part, which will actually only proceed until the theoretical part begins, which is then divided in 2 parts. So there will be 5.1, 5.2, and 5.3. And in this first part, we are, so to speak, only having a look into the practical side, meaning the OECD Factbook mainly, and the rest is about to follow then in part 2 and 3. After all that, then we will be finally more than ready actually to dive or to go or to just understand, comprehend AIF specifics regarding CG. Yes, actually regarding the AIF industry, I could have also said. So, ladies and gentlemen, you do know what is awaiting you. I think we are ready to start. So actually let me go for a coffee and then we continue with the Factbook analysis. All right, ladies and gentlemen, we are now inside the OECD Factbook about corporate governance 2023. First of all, global markets and current developments of what actually? But by the way, we are going to have a look now first at the global development. And of what was the question? And of course, of equity market, of the equity market. And again, you might ask yourself, why equity markets? Why the heck? Let me lend you some hand here to comprehend it again. This is important in regards for equity markets are, excluding here the alternative segment in this case, consisting mostly of public equity, since we're talking about PLCs. Simultaneously, they are also providing actually these very companies, these very public companies, with capital after they have been listed already. That are the so-called SPOs, but we will come on that a bit later. Notwithstanding the fact that equity markets are as well contributing to the overall resilience of the economy, since they usually, actually always continue offering capital once bank lending, was tending to contract, which is usually the case in a crisis situation. And as we saw in recent history, actually like 15 years ago, that then is strengthening resilience, this sector. And besides, actually, they are the largest asset class available to households, putting money as well into the corporate sector. That's why we have to have a look at, because corporate governance is concerning these very companies. And therefore, now we will organize, first of all, a global development. I mean, where are we standing globally? What is the case? How this whole thing is looking like? And corporate governance, actually, to support my first fact, as the name implies, is about corporate governance. So it is about corporations. Therefore, we need to have a look at it. Okay, as mentioned before, now we do look really at it in general terms. So not related to the AAF industry. And this is, first of all, just an overall overview about the situation, how it appears in the year 2023. At the end of the financial year 2022, 44K listed companies made up the already mentioned 98 trillion US dollars as market cap. For around 31K of these companies, ownership data is available, for which one is able now creating a figure picturing the key markets and regions according to the number of listed companies. As we can see here in the very figure, which is out of the book, the US remains the largest market, while Asia actually has the highest number of listed companies. So the bubble size is representing the share of the global market cap, which is, I think, self-explaining. And one can see a development from 2017 to 2022 from 84 trillion to 98 trillion US dollars in the market capitalization, while listed companies grew from 41K to 44K in 2017 to 2022. This, in effect, is due to the fact that emerging economies, registered a significant growth rate. Meanwhile, advanced economies actually have seen a continuous decrease in IPOs, actually in numbers of listed companies. That's the way I have to say it, which again is due to the fact that there has been a decline in listings of smaller growth companies. And thereby we are coming actually to the IPO trends. Delving into the public equity markets now, they have changed. Well, that is quite obvious. Over the years, certainly. In the 90s, some may probably remember this time not only as trying to learn desperately how to ride a bicycle. Like me, I do remember the 90s. But maybe some remember the 90s and the economic facts which were irrelevant in that time. And actually, especially from the UK, Germany, France, and Italy, because they were actually at the forefront in the IPO game, in the IPO market, better to speak. They pretty much led the show, contributing, I think, like 41%, I think, yeah, 41% of the global IPO capital, with over 3,500 listings. So in the decade from 1990 to 2000, excluding the year 2000, of course. But things have really shifted since then. And that is quite obvious, and this is also quite clear. It would be strange if not. But to give you some example, to offer you some examples, in Germany, for example, one of these 3,500 listings, which were to leading the show back then, in Germany, the Deutsche Telekom had a significant IPO in 1996. In truth, one of the largest IPOs globally, while opening also, of course, the telecommunication sector in Germany. Actually, it's been the same in France just 1 year later, 1997. There it's been what is called now Orange, for the French viewers, or for at least someone who knows about French telecommunication. Back then it was still called France Telecom France. I'm not sure which way around. And this IPO had actually a similar effect. Regarding Italy, we have to go back a bit more in time, 1993, actually the year of my birth. Enel, or I don't know how to pronounce it in Italian, Enel, was going public back then. Enel is actually the multinational energy company besides effectively Also, this event was marking then the privatization of Italy's energy sector. Everything is privatized these days. And then, back then it started. So, that just as a practical example. So, you can actually imagine something under all these words and numbers. So, now, looking at Asian companies now, they have stepped up their game a lot, actually. That's 22%. In the 1990s, they are now raking in a whooping 44% of global IPO proceeds from 2012 to 2022. So this is the period we are looking at. This is almost the half. If I may be allowed to remember you, that 44% is almost the half of 100%, yes. So it's a lot. That's what I want to underline thereby. What's effectively impressive is how these non-financial Asian companies are outshining their financial counterparts. In case of China, for example, their IPOs have literally exploded, accounting for nearly a third of global IPOs, generally. That's quite the leap from where they were in the late 90s. Actually, they were far off that. As an example also here, in 2014, that is maybe something one may remember, at least me, I do remember that. There was the IPO of Alibaba. Alibaba. I don't know in English. Alibaba? I think it's everywhere the same. Actually, one of the largest IPOs in history, raising over 25 billion US dollars. Actually, it made its debut in the NISE, so New York Stock Exchange. And it was going there, it was listed there in the ticker as Baba. And Baba is, funnily, also the Turkish word for father. Or actually, like in a slang way, it can mean something like bro. Well, just as an information. Japan, despite of a bid in the early 2000s, bounced back with a 15% increase in IPO proceeds during the period from 2012 to 2022. That's always our second period here. Actually, there will be the third invited, which is then in between, from 2001 to 2011. Well, conversely, Latin American companies seem to be taking a step back, actually, in the global capital market scene in terms of IPOs. At least there's been a noticeable 38% decline in their IPO raised capital between 2001 and 2011 and 2012 to 2023. So these two periods, I could have just said also from 2001 to 2023. Well, howsoever for Latin America comes to my mind, but it was in 2009, I think, from Banco Brazil. What's the name? Banco Brazil. It was 8 billion that was raised thereby, and that was the largest IPO ever in Latin America. Banco Santander, Brazil. Now, I remember it. Okay, also to provide you with an example for the Latin American continent. Well, I did actually not give an example for Japan. But who cares? Japan, they do produce very weird movies. Actually, it's not been a movie. I've been watching recently the movie Old Boy, which is actually a South Korean, yeah, South Korean movie, but it goes back to Japanese manga, and I don't know, it's I cannot really recommend to watch this movie. So therefore, I won't provide an example for Japan. No, this is just a joke, but I don't come up with any example in my mind. So, no example, you have to look it up yourself. Excuse me. So coming back to the topic from Japanese manga, we see each one having their moment in terms of IPOs in the spotlight at different times, of course. Thereby one is also able to see how dynamic this IPO market actually is. Actually, referring again to the Asian IPOs, or actually to the IPO count, beginning of 2023, 56% of the world's listed companies were listed in Asian stock exchanges. That's from a market cap point of view, around about 30% of market capitalization. So of the world's listed companies generally. Actually, besides the Asian rush here, only Sweden is within the top 10. I mean, now speaking from a European standpoint, that's our only country, Europeans. Okay, all right. IPOs and weird movies are dealt with now. But there's also what I've mentioned in just a few minutes ago. There are also the secondary IPOs. And of course, also they do have trends. And let's have a look at them. But first of all, just let me clarify actually what to understand under secondary IPO. Short, they're called SPOs. And they also go by the name follow-on offerings, plural. And to make this maybe a little bit more concrete, you may remember when Facebook was going to market in 2012 by Morgan Stanley, JP Morgan, Goldman Sachs, and etc. as underwriters. But you may remember as well that in 2013 they were actually offering additional shares for growth reasons, of course, to raise more capital. And this is actually what is meant by an SPO. Actually, it means only offering additional shares. A more maybe recent and one that is more in the minds of the viewers might be the one from 2020, which subject was Tesla. Tesla wanted to leverage actually their huge demand for their stocks. Practically then that was followed by a significant surge in its market valuation. That's been 2020, so I think that it should be clear by now what an SPO is. Issuance of additional shares. It's quite simple. Especially, one can imagine, in 2008. So in the 2008 crisis, this played kind of a role since it provided, of course, the corporate sector with equity. 2012 and 2022, this period, 7.8 trillion US dollars were raised thereby, which is more than twice the amount of the 1990s. I mean, which were raised in the 1990s. Europe and the US are dominant regarding the volume of SPOs. The proceeds increased over 1/3 from 1990 to 2000, so the 1990s, and 2012 to 2022. China's SPO role was actually quasi insignificant in the 1990s. Nowadays, they raised 1.55 trillion US dollars in equity. Thus, this reflects 21% of the global raising of equity during this period. And now we are talking about the 2012 to 2022 period. Also, SPOs are or become significant if one looks at the development of IPO and SPO. I mean, the relation between these two, especially in terms of the total amount that is raised in both taken together. And in 2009, one can imagine it was the financial crisis back then. So SPOs peaked back then to 89% actually, and only 11% were IPOs of the total proceeds. US and Europe again experienced a decrease in IPOs, but an increase in SPOs, and this may stem from mergers and acquisitions, which are actually financed by SPOs. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not aware if you are aware that the carnival season has started already this year, so I think you should be aware by now. And actually, ladies and gentlemen, a question I do have to the viewers which are going through this experience here. How are you able to drink alcohol? If you are drinking alcohol, I don't understand why. I would rather be cocaine addicted, I guess, than alcohol addicted. It would be the worst. But actually, to drink alcohol, I don't understand what. It's useless. It destroys your brain, ladies and gentlemen, and I am right now I am the living proof of that. Anyways, I decided to guide you further through the OECD Factbook now. Now, ladies and gentlemen, after we have dealt with this core overview a bit, let us have a look into changes in the corporate ownership and investor landscape. Why? And actually, what does that mean? The corporate investor landscape, ownership and investor landscape, excuse me. Who is actually owning all this public equity? That's the question here. And for example, the German telecom that I've mentioned somewhere before in the video as an example. So, in this graphic that we do see here, we can see, and luckily also, we do not have to even think so much, for the authors of this very book came already on the idea to put it all into a global scale, which you can see here at the top. So what is noticeable, ladies and gentlemen? Yes, we see that institutional investors do own the biggest part here with 44% on a global scale. While there is to mention that they may own more because of they are also somehow included in this free-floating part segment here, which eloquently is representing the very part of investors which do not reach the threshold for mandatory disclosure of their shareholdings, and retail investors as well. Actually, they are also included, in case one was wondering, as we can extract as well from this very figure with 70%. The US is actually here the leading case in the institutional investor control over equity position. So this counts as well for Europe and Japan. I mean, not the 70%, but they are also in the leading case here in the institutional investor side. And then China.
China, to me, China. China. You want to buy from China?
On the other hand, we do see has only 11% of institutional investors, and thereby this is the lowest market capitalization overall. But China,
So don't tell me about China. I know China.
with 30% in the hand of the public sector, again, then here is leading in the public sector area. While we see that in Asia and Latin America,
Nobody loves the Hispanics more.
it is more about the corporate ownership. I think with one time 26 and one time 29%, if I'm correct. Yes, I'm correct. Of course, I'm correct. Japan, the manga country.
Japan.
Maybe to mention here as well. In this segment, I mean, similar to Asia and Latin America, also with 22% in the corporate ownership. So it is not really deniable that private corporations and holdings, as well, holding companies, are quite important owners in listed companies, and in many cases actually also like organizations in terms of group structures. Well, we will have a look at that soon. So thereby we can finish this topic already, and we can have a look to where this leads us. And it leads to the question, respective how we would say in the German law, neutral third party, which from its very logical creation is unable to exist. Anyways, we do have it in the German law. Well, this we can transfer this to the neutral company party. And that was actually not meant a company party for 50 years, isn't that company? But, and now we are again at the beginning of the sentence where I wanted to continue actually, respective an average company. That's what is meant thereby. An average company in one of the following jurisdictions. And the question that, well, is rising is, what is the distribution of ownership? How is it distributed among these? And thereby, how is the ownership concentration organized by their relative market? This was a long sentence. However, therefore, we do have this very figure here that we can see now in place. And to the explanation, I mean, the largest shareholder plus the three largest shareholders after the largest shareholder together make up more than 50% of the company's equity and capital. Yes. So we do see, I mean, I think this is quite self-explaining somehow. I mean, like, I explained it anyways for the ones who are maybe only listening. We do see in Peru, Argentina, Chile, and Indonesia, more than 60% of companies have a single shareholder holding more than half of the equity and capital. Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I do have more than one shirt at home. All right, ladies and gentlemen, let's explore corporate bonds. Why? Well, the sustained periods of expansive monetary policy have likely prompted riskier issuers to borrow through corporate bonds and other instruments. Yes, that's the case. Comparable to equity, bonds do offer long-term financing options versus conventional bank loans do serve as a strategic capital source regularly for diversifying a company's capital base, for example. Why examining corporate bonds financing in CG matters, in corporate governance context? Well, a failure to grasp this either indicates a lack of concentration of the viewer, or it shows careful consideration, for it would not be clear to myself, actually, by what is being said until now, this short elaboration on. To elucidate this, the upsurge in corporate bond utilization has significantly amplified the significance of corporate bonds in corporate governance. For instance, contractual clauses, which are always included in bond agreements aimed at safeguarding bondholders, exert a notable influence on the governance framework of issuers. These clauses then encompass various aspects spanning from outlining dividend distribution conditions to mandating issuer compliance with specific disclosure prerequisites, for example. So, a notable aspect of the global corporate bond market landscape since 1990, that's somehow the frame we're moving in the whole time, has been the discernible erosion in credit quality. With a few exceptions in 2018 and 2022, the proportion of non-investment grade bonds has consistently exceeded 20% of total bond issuance annually, which is not good, ladies and gentlemen. No. In 2021, 35% of non-financial corporate bond issuances comprised non-investment grade bonds. This is worse, ladies and gentlemen. Due to tighter financing conditions in 2022, non-investment grade bonds share reduced to 14% of total issuances. For the preceding 4 years, BBB bonds, actually BBB rated bonds, there are no BBB bonds. Probably they are. I don't know if that's an abbreviation for some company. The lowest investment grade category, this is what is meant by BBB rated, averaged a significant 55%. 55, that's over the half, ladies and gentlemen. I mean, I know that you know that, but I want to present it to you with the inherent dramatic this has. Of all investment grade issuances, representing a heightened share compared to earlier periods, ladies and gentlemen, the world is going to an end, as it seems, at least from this perspective here. Excuse me. In 2020, at the onset of the COVID-19 pandemic, corporate bonds issuance surged to 3.3 trillion annually, of course, dropping to 2.7 trillion in 2021 and to 1.7 trillion in 2022 due to stringent monetary policies, still in the realm of shortly available memory of the viewer, since it is not that long ago. Of course, if you're watching this in 2055, then it may be different. From 2001 to 2011, the average issuance stood at 1.2 trillion US dollars, just as a comparison, while the average then from 2012 to 2022, in which also do fall the recently mentioned years of 2020, 21 and 22, it averaged 2.3 trillion annually. How much is that more? 1.1 trillion. So, yeah, it's a lot. In current times, ladies and gentlemen, including Japan and China, has witnessed a 40-fold increase in corporate bond issuance compared to the 1990s. This trend occurred in Europe as early as 2012. We Europeans. And in the US, there has been at least a tripling since the 1990s. Yes, and notably, the US accounted for 40% of total issuances from 2012 to 2022, so our last period here, with China contributing 21%, and Europe 19%. So China is above the global issuances. Clearly, the US holds a dominant role here in this arena, ladies and gentlemen. However, consider this. In 2008, the global outstanding amount of non-financial corporate bonds was 8.3 trillion. Yeah? By 2021, this doubled, ladies and gentlemen, and we have 16.6 trillion. Anyhow, in 2022, it dropped significantly to 15.4 trillion, possibly due to post-COVID conditions. Well, regarding the composition of outstanding non-financial corporate bonds, approximately 45% are US bonds, with European and Chinese bonds accounting for 20% and 16% in case of China. Bonds from non-financial companies in Asia, again excluding China and Japan, always when Asia is mentioned, don't add China and Japan. But everything else, that is Asia, Asia represent non-financial companies in Asia represent 6% of the total outstanding amount, so not much. Other regions combined outstanding accounts account for less than 5%. What exactly does this signify about the outstanding amount of non-financial corporate bonds? Allow me to briefly clarify this situation. Outstanding shares encompass the authorized and issued shares held by investors. However, it is, of course, important to note that outstanding shares exclude treasury shares, i.e. company repurchased shares. You could verify actually the number of outstanding shares in the equity section of a company's balance sheet. Well, should you ever wish to exercise your free will in doing so. Ladies and gentlemen, you have now covered this specific aspect, leaving room for further explanation. Specifically an aspect the OECD emphasizes, or wants you to know, corporate sustainability. You can find this under section 1.8 in the, corresponding Factbook 2023. That's the topic now. I hope it's clear by now why we've had a look at corporate bond financing trends. Let's have a look at the a little bit vaster point of the corporate sustainability. I am aware, esteemed ladies and gentlemen, that delving through statistics may prove to be not that laborious, and it is also not a simple task for the presenter to render it reasonably engaging. Yes, I shall endeavor nonetheless. At the conclusion, I welcome your esteemed judgment as to whether I have met this challenge adequately. To be candid, I subjected myself to an AI's rendition of the ensuing segment and found myself overwhelmed by the sheer monotony of the enumerating indices and percentages, so I do understand you quite well. Thankfully, my esteemed audience, I'm not an AI-generated voice contributing to further envy. Very well then, let us direct our focus now towards corporate sustainability. Let us perceive this as the concluding chapter of this 5.1 video, a milestone you will reach thereafter, unlike myself. Cherish life's moments, ladies and gentlemen, because I'm going to further present some other stuff. Well, beyond this fact, corporate sustainability, in essence, stands as a crucial subject given its current prominence. Arguably, individuals within the industry, depending on their respective roles, have likely encountered its significance already. Let us now and last delve into the minutiae of this matter, ladies and gentlemen. Come on. Why is this insignificant, I wanted to say. Why, of course, this is significant. I wanted to provide you with some more facts, with some more teasing facts. So, the corporate sector, ladies and gentlemen, plays a pivotal role, of course, in propelling the transition towards a sustainable low-carbon economy. Very understandably. So climate change possesses financially significant risk, actually, to publicly listed companies, representing two-thirds, 66% in numbers, yes, of global market capitalization. Matters pertaining to human rights, human capital, community relations, and the connections to, water and wastewater management. That's the word, not the connections to, but the management of that is included, as well as supply chain management. In the textile industry, for example, very significant, but actually everywhere. But there it is always in the press. In the press, many people do read. Of course, there are also many more sustainability-related concerns. Well, and these things do pose risks, actually, plural, to many publicly listed companies. Hence, this chapter has been newly incorporated in the 2023 Factbook, in the Principles work in 2023. Another, principality of the OECD, and the link to this resource is also available in the video description below. So, what's the current status about all that matters? About all these matters? A requirement in law or regulations has been established in nearly two-thirds of jurisdictions. With, of the 49 OECD Factbook jurisdictions, which you can actually also find in the description, while a requirement in listing rules has been set in only 8% of jurisdictions, which is to comprehend in this figure. In 24% of jurisdictions, sustainability-related disclosure is a recommendation provided by codes or principles, including frameworks set by regulatory bodies or exchanges as well, following a comply or explain approach. So it's comparable to soft binding law, like something like the OECD itself or ESMA, for example. So concerning the applicability of such relevant provisions, specific requirements or recommendations, sustainability-related information needs to be disclosed only by listed companies in 25 jurisdictions. So that is more than the half. Well, it's a little bit more than half, but still it's more than half. Well, or it is recommended to do so for these 25 jurisdictions, whereas in the other 24 jurisdictions, thereby it is slightly more than half. Such a disclosure framework encompasses both listed and non-listed companies. Okay, good to know that. And what are the changes, or what are the current developments, better to speak? What are the current changes? By current is, of course, not meant like a daily thing, but what has happened within the last years since the prior Factbook was released. So within the European Union, the 2014 Non-Financial Reporting Directive, short NFRD, you know that I love to throw around these abbreviations, has been the main source for the member countries, of course, of the EU in sustainability-related disclosure requirements. That's been the case until when? Yeah, we will see in a flash. NFRDs, or this NFRD actually, since it is only one directive, but they do require listed companies as well as non-listed companies, which are public interest entities, above certain thresholds. It is measured by certain thresholds which need to be fulfilled to disclose sustainability information. However, companies may choose, after this framework, the disclosure standard they prefer to use, and there are many around. Just Google it. There are a lot. these disclosure, excuse me, ladies and gentlemen, standards. Yeah, well, it's a lot. So what's the new thing now? Well, the 2022 Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, also called CSRD, ladies and gentlemen, will generate some important changes. Why will? Isn't 2022 already the past? Yes, it is. At least in my world. Yes, it entered into force, the CSRD, by the 5th of January 2023. Which is also the past, yes. It is part of the European Green Deal. The European Green Deal is something you can read about also in a link in the description if you are interested in reading about the European Green Deal. So the first companies, why it is still relevant even though it's in the past, will have to apply the new rules for the first time in 2024. But actually, in reports which will be then published in 2025 for the financial year 2024. And companies which are subject to the CSRD regulatory framework will have to report according to the European Sustainability Reporting Standards, short ESRS. These standards were developed actually by EFRAG, EFRAG. Yes, it's correct. Which was previously known as the European Financial Reporting Advisory Group, EFRAG Advisory Group. Yeah, I'm right. Find everything regarding that in the link in the description. Since about that one could also talk like various hours. Okay, so CSRD we do have in place, well, not effectively in place, but it is in place in 2024 for the financial year 2024, which is very soon, ladies and gentlemen. By now, in November 2023, this is then required. So until then, nearly 8,000 companies listed across 73 global markets disclosed sustainability-related information in 2021. Yeah. So after which regulatory framework? We know they can choose it. Okay, catering to investors focused on sustainability. And these companies, these 8,000 companies across these 73 markets, they represent 84% of the global market capitalization, ranging from 66%, two-thirds, ladies and gentlemen, in China, and excuse me, where sustainability-related disclosure is merely recommended, to 95% in Europe, of course. However, these companies constitute only 19%. Ladies and gentlemen, 19% is not even a fifth of 100%, which is usually taken as, well, one or the whole. Well, it's 19% of all globally listed companies. In this case, varying from 17% in China to 34% in Europe, which you can also comprehend in the figure, which will be appearing somewhere at the screen right now, hopefully. All right, this disparity, 34% and 17% is the double or the half, depending on which way you want to see it. Where is this disparity coming from between these market capitalization proportions and the number of companies which can be partially elucidated by the allowance in 30 jurisdictions for smaller listed companies? We've heard about that, SMEs, growth markets, for example, to abstain from disclosing sustainability-related matters. Information, actually, not matters. Furthermore, in the 12 jurisdictions, merely recommending the disclosure of sustainability-related information, larger listed companies might be more inclined to respond to institutional investors' demand for such information, which is kind of self-explaining, I think. So what are the news here in these regards? Well, consistency, comparability, and reliability of sustainability-related information can be also reinforced if it follows, quote, high quality, understandable, enforceable, and internationally recognized standards as recommended by the principles of the OECD. By the way, the 49 jurisdictions of the fact book here, which were surveyed, 6, and I have to mention them, particularly Australia, Canada, Colombia, Japan, Singapore, and the UK. They require or recommend to use an international disclosure standard, while another 11, which I of course do not see any need in pointing out in particularly to the viewer, they require or recommend a local one, which is of course not that good. So the remaining 32 jurisdictions, which I of course don't feel the need to name them in particular at all, they allow companies to disclose their sustainability-related information according to the reporting framework of their choice. So, this is not good, ladies and gentlemen, this is not good. Global Reporting Initiative standards. Did you ever hear about them? Me not, to be honest. Well, but by reading this part, I have. So, and also Task Force on Climate-Relating Financial Disclosure, TCFD. And the prior one, the Global Reporting Initiative, is of course short GRI. To furthermore throw some abbreviations into the space. Well, and these institutions or initiatives, they do also, of course, have recommendations, and actually, they are actually, these abbreviations stand for these recommendations. Or you can take, for example, the SASB standards, which were used in the 2021 sustainability-related disclosure by companies representing an average of 42% of market capitalization. So the CDP questionnaires, another abbreviation, known as Climate Disclosure Project, they were used by listed companies representing 55%. So finally, a little bit more than the half here, of market capitalization globally. Well, there are existing regional variations in these matters of CDP. For instance, TCFD recommendations were prominent in most, and TCFD, we remember the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. They were prominent in most regions, except China, and others. And SASB standards were used less in China and Japan. Yeah, that's actually the truth, ladies and gentlemen. But one of the most relevant sustainability-related metrics for many companies is greenhouse gases. Yes, I won't explain to you now like what greenhouse gases are, but you feel free to watch a documentary about it. It won't harm you in any way. Abbreviation GHG. Another one. Isn't it great? GHG, standing for greenhouse gases emissions. Well, the emissions I just added. It's of course standing only for greenhouse gases. But of course the emissions are meant. So more than 5,000 listed companies, representing 72% this time of global market capitalization, publicly disclosed their 2021 GHG emissions resulting directly from their activities. And indirect emissions related to their energy consumption, which is also known as Scope 1 and Scope 2. The first one was, of course, Scope 1, and what I'm saying now is Scope 2 of GHG emissions. Well, 72% disclosed these two scopes. 3,300 companies, which is 56% of market capitalization, disclosed the emissions generated also by their supply chains, known as, who wants to guess it? Well, it's then the GHG3 scope. But of course, we do have an exception, since exceptions are somehow not to avoid, of companies listed in China. Companies representing at least 40% of market capitalization in China. In the other selected regions, disclose GHG emissions reduction targets with higher shares in Europe, the United States, and Japan. And Japan. Mangas. But Europe. Again, I'll have to point out some countries in particular. Actually 6. Belgium, France, Greece, Hungary, Indonesia, Poland, Portugal, and Switzerland, they do have a regulatory requirement by law. I mean, a legal regulatory requirement, not compliant, for the recommendation of the principles that, quote, the corporate governance framework should ensure that boards adequately consider material sustainability, risks, and opportunities when fulfilling their key functions. Now one has to just have a look at who is sitting in a board of a regular, huge, publicly listed company. One can estimate their understanding of these kind of issues. Because even me, I don't have a high degree understanding of these, of the calculation of these frameworks, and not to talk about the chemistry that underlies all that. Well, yeah, just besides. All right, in half of the jurisdictions surveyed in the Factbook, boards are explicitly required to actually recommend to approve policies on sustainability-related matters, such as sustainability plans and targets, as well as internal control policies and management sustainability risks. Listing rules are actually only existing in 3 jurisdictions, to mention Hong Kong, China, Singapore, and South Africa. In these 3 jurisdictions, there are legal regulatory requirements for listings. In these regards, to boards consider to create them because they have to. And what I'm actually talking about is committees for sustainability. That is the case in the US to 65% of the total market capitalization. In Asia, again, excluding China and Japan, it's 54%, and in all others it is 55%, while it is actually less common to point that out, particularly in Japan with only 21%, as well as in China with 13%. Now, coming to an end here, with ESG rating scores, usually subject to EU Regulation 2016/1011, which is also called the EU Benchmarks Regulation. There is also another EU regulation from 2019, 2089, I hope. I think it's the right one. EU Paris-aligned benchmarks for index providers, I think. So probably you will never look that up. But it is correct. So you can. Let me tell you as a final word here, outside the European Union, these very index providers, including ESG index providers, of course, are only regulated in China and the United Kingdom, among the fact-booked jurisdictions, ladies and gentlemen. Da-da-da-da, you've made it. Yes, this is everything I wanted you to know regarding the introduction, the practical side of the introduction to corporate governance. Since I started this already, I of course wanted to not make it completely, and thereby I was going through the whole book. And you do find this longer version, this extended version, also in the description of the video. In case you are interested in the corporate governance and institutional frameworks which are existing, the rights of shareholders and key ownership functions, and the corporate board of directors, all the current developments, changes, new regulations, and so on and so forth, yeah, then just watch the extended, which will be available shortly after this version here will be published, because that is what I'm going to do right now until it is done. Well, I hope this clarified a little bit the situation, and I think this is a good introduction to the now more theoretical side, because now you can always refer back to what you do already know, how things are currently. Thank you for watching. If you found it useful, then consider to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and enjoy your life. That's actually the main thing. Thanks for watching.